I'm on to the stage of the project where I'm fitting my deck beams. I've got a rough idea of what my cockpit shape is going to be, and I've determined that just by using some flexible battens and laying them out on my crossballs here and throwing in a few other sticks just to sort of represent where deck beams might go. And I'm happy with what I have there, so that's fine. And now I'm just putting in the actual deck beams, and I'm using Sitka spruce for those. And I'm starting out with some rough stock that's dimensioned down to my final thickness, which is 5/8 of an inch, and turning them into a finished deck beam, although there's still a little bit more material I can remove here, but I want to get them fitted in place before I remove any more material. But for the most part, I'm happy with this dimension. And the way I'm doing it is very simple. It starts by taking a piece of my rough stock and just laying it over my deck beam location, giving myself an extra inch at each end just for playing around with, and then I'm going to rough cut that off. Now that I've got that cut off, I choose whichever side I feel is going to be the best portion of the material for my deck beam, and there's sort of a slight flaw here, for instance, so I'll work below that. So that's going to be my bottom. And I take my deck crown pattern. Now technically this is not the right crown to use because I should be using a slightly smaller radius for the inside of the deck beam, but it's so negligible in this size of material that it's not worth messing around with. So we're just going with that. With a line drawn on there, I can now go over to my bandsaw and I'm going to rough cut that out. Just a couple strokes with a spoke shave is all that needs to clean it up. Now I've created a separate pattern here. So that's got my deck crown on the top surface, and I've just drawn on the inside curve below that, and I've just popped a couple of nails on there, and those are just to carry the bottom edge of my deck beam. And since I'm getting wider and wider, it probably wouldn't be a dumb idea for me to place nails farther out. Those were placed inboard for the sake of my smaller deck beams. So by placing my deck beam stock up against those nails, I can flip it over and then draw my deck crown onto the other side. And then it's back to the bandsaw to cut that out. So there we go. I've cleaned up that outer surface on my big belt sander, and I could have just done it with a block plane if I felt like it, but it's such a flat, gentle curve. The belt sander is extremely fast, and so that's all there is to it. The next job will be to fit these in place. Got a few more deck beams to knock out, and then the ones at the forward and aft end of the cockpit area we refer to as king beams. The king beams get to be pretty much exactly the same, but we do tend to make them a little bit heavier. Okay folks, we're going to cut carlin joints. Okay, what's a carlin joint? Very simply, it's a very specific kind of joint. It's a bit like a half lap, but it's got sort of a beveled shoulder as well. Now the idea behind a carlin joint is it's a joint that is made for taking a lot of downward pressure and also compression from the sides. So if your boat's being squeezed, it's got some hard shoulders that prevent it from being squashed too far, and thus it prevents the joint from being popped out. And then it's also got these little steps on there, little half lap shoulders, so that when you push down, it's got a positive stop. So in both directions, it has a positive stop. However, unlike a half lap joint, the bottom half of it tapers out. And the idea being is that you've got a very small shoulder, but you've got a taper that's the full depth of the entire joint. And that means that you get the minimum amount of material taken out of the end of your deck beam and the minimum amount of material taken out the end of our shear clamp. Now they're called carlin joints because they're specifically intended for use on carlins, which is sort of the framework that's around an opening in a boat. So where a house is or a cockpit is, we have these members in there called carlins. Now carlins are a little bit tricky to cut, but not a lot tricky. They're no harder than cutting a dovetail, for instance, and they're actually kind of fun. Now the kind of cool bit about it is there's a little bit of faith you have to have in your layout. I made life tricky for myself because my shear clamps are tapered fore and aft in depth, and the carlin joint wants a consistent depth. So what that means is as I'm moving through the boat, every time I put a deck beam in, I actually have to change the depth of the deck beam. I've got to reduce it down to do the same depth as the clamp. I don't absolutely have to do that, but for the sake of the layout process, that's what it demands to lay it out cleanly and efficiently. And frankly, I think that's a good way to sort of lighten up the ends of the boats too. As the clamps taper, so do the deck beams, really. These carlins are pretty small, they're fiddly, and they're actually hard to do them well because of their size. They were bigger, there's just more wiggle room to sort of dial them in. With these guys, there's only so much I can do. My fits on these may not look perfect when I'm done, but that's okay, because we're putting it all together with epoxy, and that epoxy is going to fill any little gaps, and it's going to make it for a stronger joint anyway. So while the craftsman in me says, make it tight, 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 the boat builder in me says, when I'm using epoxy, to make it loose, 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 because epoxy likes itself more than it likes wood. Okay, step one is we have to locate our deck beam. So I've got some layout marks here. You want your pencil good and sharp. We're just going to draw a line on either side of our deck beam on top of our shear clamps. Okay, and I can move that out of the way for the moment. Now step two, use my miter square, and I want to set it for half the depth of our carlins. So I just take a quick reading here, and we are 7/8, so that makes it 7/16. Okay, so we lay off half the depth of our carlins, or our deck beams, on top there. And we're just going to square down. I've got epoxy on my shear clamps here, so it doesn't hold a pencil line very, very well. So we'll just give it a quick score with a knife while we're at it too. Now step two is I take my deck beam and I lay it back on those marks. And what I need to do is I need to mark off where the ends of this deck beam is going to lie. So I pick up these same two little points, just the depth of our joint. And while I'm here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slide that mark over to the edge of the shear clamp, and I'm going to trace underneath it. So we'll do that on both sides. And that's giving me the angle that this joint has to be cut at on the deck beam itself. Okay, that's all I need to do with that right now. Now this guy, our first step is to just cut a line from the back of our joint to our inside corner. Now this is where I made life hard for myself. I've actually got a bevel on here, so I'm cutting it a little farther back to the inside edge of my bevel because that's what I got to do. But it's also resulting in making it a little more difficult to do this joint. So we'll pretend that I didn't do that. hard for me to lean over and look underneath here. I'm just going to use a little mirror to check that I'm at my full depth. That's pretty good. A couple more little light strokes. Now we want the back of this cut to be nice and straight. Our next job is to chop away the waste. So make sure your chisel's good and sharp for this. I'm just using the palm of my hand as a very light mallet. And this is where you got to be very careful you don't stab yourself in the liver. I'm going to quickly switch to a longer chisel, see if this, I like paring chisels for this, but I don't really have the depth in my hole to use it properly. So if you're worried about blowing out the bottom of your joint there, what you can do is you can come at it at a slight angle and just whittle away a little bit first. Come from each side, and that'll help to prevent blowout. Using my inspection mirror here to see underneath the joint, because it's hard for me to reach under there. A little further to go. And just use the edge of your chisel as a straight edge to judge whether or not you got your joint straight. And of course, it's just the lower half we mostly need to worry about it being straight. The upper half is going to get chopped away. But it's important for us to have this clean angle from this joint down to the bottom, because that's part of our layout. So this joint is very important to be systematic about how you do it. Our next job is to take that same depth. Remember we went in here, half of the thickness of the carlin, or the clamp, or the deck beam, whichever you want to call it. We're going to create a shelf. And we're just going to use our square set at the same amount. We're just going to draw a little line inside here. That's going to be the depth of our shelf. And I do find sometimes a lighter chisel, thinner chisel, better for this kind of thing. I like these paring chisels because I got a lot of, feel like I have a lot of leverage with them. And then I just kind of do this by eye. I start by just kind of doing some plunge cuts with my chisel coming in from the side here. And then I'll try and whittle out what I can. I don't go right to the line to start with, just sort of try and get rid of a chunk of the waste. And as I get down lower, then I turn my chisel over and try and come in a little closer to my line. So it's just a question of just coming at it from, I've only got a couple directions I can come at it from to clear out these corners. And if your boat's got a lot of shape, you might need skew chisels to get into these spots. As much as I can, I try and stand off to the side from the direction of my chisel here. I mean, sometimes I gotta sort of do it with my belly right in behind it, but there's always a chance for accidents, and we'd rather not have one if we can avoid it. Every now and then you're sort of forced to do the dangerous thing just because there's no other way to manipulate your tools. Now, as I say, this kind of thing is way easier to do on a bigger boat with bigger materials. Now, of course, I get it done very quickly on a little boat, but it's just a little bit sloppy. Just a little bit. And of course, we're working with Sitka spruce, which is soft and yet
wiry, and so it sometimes doesn't give you the smoothest finish unless your tools are super razor sharp, and I do my best to get mine there, but sometimes they're not always there. But a less than glass smooth joint is actually a benefit for us because of the epoxy wanting some tooth to bond to, so we aren't going to get hung up on it. There we go, done right. My shelf has got a right angle wall on it. My shelf has also got a right angle floor on it, and it comes right to the sides of my little slot here. So I'm going to do that on the other side, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to show you what I would do with the ends of the deck beam. So there's another bit of layout we have to do, basically transferring this information onto there. Okay, so here's a little trick. We need these cuts to be, first cuts to be plumb. So here's the end of my deck beam. Here's the end of my deck beam. They are a compound angle on an angle of the rake of the hull, but we need this sort of plumb cut at the end. So if I take a straight edge with a square end and I touch both points, that gives me a plumb cut right there. So I can take my I'll take a miter square here and use it to flip it around to the other side. And then we basically have, I don't have to mark both sides, but I'll do it anyway. So our first job is just to cut that off square. So next we need to draw an angle here. This is basically the depth of the notch that we created. Except before we laid it off on the top, now we're laying the same depth off on the bottom. Now I'm using a bevel gauge here because I've pulled this angle off of my off of the other joint, and I did that because I am not going to the corner. It has to do with that bevel I put on the inside corner, which screws things up a little bit. So with that done, we can take this angle and we'll just carry that across. It does not hurt to mark both sides of the joint. Do this end too. So we've marked it on one side. And now the last thing is I need the depth of my shoulder. So again, we use the square. See if I can lay this off in a way that makes sense to the camera. So if I lay the square on there, there's our depth. So what we have here is, this is waist, that's waist, that's waist, and that's waist. And we get this nice little half lap joint, basically with a slanted shoulder on it, or a slanted leg on it, however you want to look at it. It looks far more complicated than it actually is. And cutting this is easy as can be. I'm going to use my luthier's vise for cutting this just because it gets it up higher where I can see it and where you can see it. But you don't need to use a vise like this for cutting this. It's just, this is a convenience that I happen to have set up already. So I just cut along that slanted shoulder until I hit my little haunch. I'm just going to stop right there. And now this is all end grain, I can just use a chisel and just go pop that off. And I always pop it off a little strong of the joint, and then I can whittle it back a couple of strokes. You got to be careful because your grain's kind of running off at an odd angle there. And if your saw cut is a little bit strong, well, this is when you doctor it up. So just pair it right back to my pencil lines. And you want your pencil lines to be good and crisp for this. No fat, chunky pencils. Sharpen those buggers up. I've got a little bit of meat here that probably needs to come off. I'm going to leave that alone because we want to fit this joint first and just make sure that we're high enough. We don't want to go too low. We can all shim it up, but it's nice if we're a little bit high and then we whittle it down to the right depth. So leaving just a bit of meat on the end of that haunch is a good thing. There we go, that looks good. Now we'll just go try it out on the boat and see how she fits. Okay, here we go. Fingers crossed. That's not bad. It's just a hair high by just not even a 1/16. Perfect. We want just a hair high here so that we can shave this off and fair all these deck beams together. That's beautiful. Let's just check underneath. So you can see underneath there, I don't have the tightest joint right here at the cheek of it, which is fine. That doesn't bother me. Most important thing is that we're tight right down here where the two walls slope together. Okay, my very last job is just beveling these bottom corners of these deck beams. I'm doing that on all of them. It just shaves a little bit of weight and softens up that profile, so I like to do that. So I'm just going to use my laminate trimmer set in a vise here. Okay, well there we have it. Here's our finished deck beam, and we'll put that in place with some adhesive. We'll be using epoxy, of course. There we go, that's a beautiful joint. And one thing you could do if you were worried about this deck spreading is this is a great joint also for taking a fastener because it's got that little shelf in there. So it's easy to create basically a pin that stops it from spreading. After I've glued them, I might just put just a very small little copper nail in there just to make sure that this will forever stay together, although I'm quite confident it's never going to come apart as it is. So that's carlin joints, a really useful joint to have in your repertoire, and it's a fun joint to cut, relatively easy joint to cut, and worth playing around with. Ciao for now, folks.